You wake to the sound of footsteps echoing against ancient stone walls, each step heavy, deliberate, and drawing closer. The cold air of the Habsburg palace seeps into your bones. You clutch the rough wool blanket around your shoulders, the smell of mildew clinging to it like a second skin. Dawn has broken over Vienna in 1793, painting the sky with pale light. Yet here, inside a forgotten tower chamber, no sun dares to enter. The small slit of a window lets in only enough light to reveal floating dust motes, dancing in silence. They are your only companions. You are 7 years old. No one has told you this, because no one tells you anything at all. Words have been withheld from you, as if speech itself were too precious for a child like you. Your name is Ferdinand, though in this place, even names have little meaning. Names belong to heirs, to siblings who are taught Latin and philosophy in gilded classrooms, who practice diplomacy in mirrored halls. You, though born of the same bloodline, are given no titles, no lessons, no future. Because behind your almond-shaped eyes and your different smile lies something the court cannot accept. You are living proof that divine blood is not immune to variation, that royal flesh too can carry what others call imperfection. The door creaks open, and your attendant enters. Not a nurse, not a governess, not even someone who looks at you as if you were a child. She is simply a woman paid to ensure you are fed and hidden. Her eyes skim past yours, refusing to meet them. She places a wooden bowl of porridge on the table, already cold, already congealed. No words, no greetings. The silence between you is not accidental. It is policy. It is the law of shame. Outside, your cousins are rehearsing minuets, their shoes clicking on polished parquet floors. Tutors correct their posture, prepare them for courts and marriages that will bind nations together. Each child is a symbol, a pawn, a vessel of political currency. But you, what would you be at a banquet? A child who might forget his manners, who might laugh at the wrong moment, who might drool when the eyes of Europe are watching. A single misstep from you could be interpreted as weakness in the dynasty itself, and weakness, in a world built on bloodlines and divine right, cannot be tolerated. So here you are, in this high stone chamber, with nothing but dust and silence. You watch the particles float and dance in the sunbeam for hours, because they are the only things that move freely. Centuries later, we would give this difference a name: Down syndrome. A condition first described in 1866 by John Langdon Down, caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21. We would understand that its traits, almond-shaped eyes, distinctive facial features, developmental delays, congenital heart problems, are biological, not divine punishment. But in your time, none of that knowledge exists. In your time, such a child is an omen, a curse, a whispered reminder that perhaps the gods are displeased. Among peasants, such children sometimes found a place. A boy who could not read Latin could still carry wood, tend chickens, or smile at neighbors who saw in him God's mysterious will. In villages, survival demanded practicality. Every pair of hands, no matter how clumsy, was worth something. But for royalty, perfection was not only desirable, it was mandatory. A child who could not learn etiquette, who could not carry the weight of lineage, was not a child at all in the eyes of the court. They were an error in the divine script. And so you sit in the shadows, a living contradiction. You are both a prince and not a prince, born into grandeur yet condemned to silence. Every royal family in Europe, from Madrid to Moscow, would face this same dilemma. When bloodlines produced difference, what should be done? The answer, almost always, was concealment. Hide the child, erase the name, pretend perfection remains unbroken. The woman closes the door behind her, her footsteps fading down the hall. The bowl of porridge grows colder. You do not cry. Children learn quickly when tears bring no comfort. Instead, you hum to yourself, arranging the crumbs on the table into patterns only you understand. You hum because no one listens, and you create because no one teaches. The tower is your kingdom, the dust your courtiers, the shaft of light your only ally. History does not record your laughter or your small hands pressing against the glass. It does not remember the tune you hum, the patterns you make, the little rituals that fill your days. History will not even remember your name. But you existed, and you were not alone. Across the palaces of Europe, behind walls and within convents, countless other children lived in the same silence. Children born into bloodlines that demanded purity, but who carried within them the simple humanity their families could not bear to see. This is where our story begins. Not in the grand coronation halls or the triumphs of kings, but in the forgotten tower rooms, in the muffled cries of children erased from memory. For every crown that glittered under torchlight, there was also a shadow, a child hidden, a life unlived, a truth denied. On a crisp July morning in 1905, at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate, a child was born into the heart of Britain's royal family. He was christened John Charles Francis, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary. For his first years, he appeared much like any other royal child. He wore the sailor suits beloved by Edwardian fashion, posed for official photographs with his siblings, and was occasionally brought before dignitaries, who cooed at the handsome little boy with bright eyes. For a while, it seemed he might live as unremarkably royal a life as any of his brothers and sisters. But then, around the age of 4, shadows crept in. First came the seizures, violent, terrifying fits that struck without warning. The physicians whispered of epilepsy, a condition poorly understood and feared. Alongside the seizures came slower signs, less dramatic but more troubling in a dynasty obsessed with polish and decorum. John's development lagged. He spoke differently, learned more slowly, and photographs revealed features that today we would recognize as consistent with Down syndrome. Yet in that time, such words had no official place in the medical reports. What appeared instead were polite euphemisms, difficulties, weaknesses, delicacy. By 1909, the boy who had once smiled in family portraits vanished from public life entirely. He was relocated to Wood Farm, a modest house on the Sandringham estate. There, surrounded not by brothers and courtiers but by fields and animals, John lived under the devoted care of his nurse, Charlotte Lala, Bill. His absence was never formally explained to the public. In royal households, silence itself was the explanation. And yet, if we look closer through diaries, letters, and fragments of memory, a more complex portrait emerges. His grandmother, Queen Alexandra, wrote tenderly in her diary about poor little Johnny, describing him as a child who delighted in simple joys. He collected acorns in the woods, watched gardeners at work for hours, and laughed with unrestrained abandon at games only he understood. His nurse Lala Bill preserved every drawing he scribbled, every treasure he tucked away in his pockets. But even love, in the royal world, was circumscribed by duty. His siblings were discouraged from visiting. His parents, bound more by monarchy than by affection, kept their distance. The boy's world shrank to a handful of rooms, a garden, and the rare kindness of servants who looked upon him not as a burden but as a boy. In January 1919, John's life ended suddenly. A severe seizure took him in his sleep. He was 13 years old. Queen Mary, upon hearing the news, wrote to a friend that his death was a great release for the poor little boy. The words, at once cold and sorrowful, captured the paradox of how royalty regarded such children, as burdens both to themselves and to their lineage, as tragedies whose deaths were framed not as losses but as mercies. And yet there is another truth, less official, more human. For those who spent time with John, there was no sense of curse or embarrassment. His nurse remembered him as endlessly affectionate, with a deep love of music and animals. One can imagine him on summer days at Wood Farm, chasing butterflies through the tall grass, laughing at the way the sun played across the pond, his happiness untouched by the burden of dynastic expectations. Prince John's short life stands at the edge of two worlds. He lived at a time when royal families still clung fiercely to secrecy, but also when photography, diaries, and eyewitness accounts could preserve what official histories tried to erase. In his story, we glimpse the stark division. To his parents and the court, he was a shadow, a liability. To those who truly knew him, he was a child, different, yes, but full of joy. The tragedy lies not only in his early death, but in what he was denied while alive. The warmth of a family's full embrace, the chance to be acknowledged as a prince in more than name, the possibility of a life shaped by compassion rather than concealment. His nurse, who carried his memory for the rest of her life, may have understood it best. For her, he was not a mistake, nor a secret, nor a mercy. He was simply John, a boy who loved laughter, who found beauty in the ordinary, who deserved far more than the shadowed place history gave him. The year was 1640, and in the glittering halls of Fontainebleau Palace, a secret was whispered behind velvet curtains. Queen Anne of Austria, wife of King Louis XIII of France, had given birth to a child whose life barely flickered before being extinguished. Court records, carefully scrubbed of details, spoke only of a weak infant who failed to thrive. But private correspondence, preserved in Vatican archives centuries later, paints a far more vivid and troubling picture. The royal physicians described features that today we would instantly recognize: a flattened nasal bridge, a single crease across the palm, a tongue that seemed too large for the small mouth. They had no name for these traits, no medical framework, only superstition and fear. The infant prince lived for exactly 43 days. His wet nurse was interrogated repeatedly, accused of negligence, even of sin, as though her care alone could explain why a child of divine bloodline had not emerged perfect. She swore her innocence, but in that age, someone had to be blamed. Anne of Austria, devout and burdened, commissioned special prayers, visited shrines, and sought celestial explanations. Some whispered that God punished the king's sins. Others cast suspicion on Anne herself, blaming her Spanish heritage or murmuring of hidden curses. Still others turned to the stars, claiming unlucky alignments had doomed the child. No one dared speak the simplest truth that nature produces variation, that imperfection is not curse but humanity. Such an idea was centuries away. The child was erased from the official genealogies, his brief existence smoothed over like an ink blot on a gilded page. Yet his life, though fleeting, left ripples in the private prayers of a queen, and in the fearful silence of a court that could not comprehend fragility at the heart of monarchy. Far to the east, another dynasty faced its own hidden sorrow. The Romanovs, rulers of Russia, left behind trails of rumor and silence that still haunt historians. In 1882, Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich welcomed the birth of a daughter. Official records are nearly mute. She appears in no genealogies, mentioned only in passing as an infant daughter, died young. And yet payroll documents from the Alexander Palace tell a different story. For 16 years after her supposed death, specific servants continued receiving wages for nursery duties in the East Wing. What child were they serving? Letters between ladies-in-waiting hint at the answer. They describe a girl who never mastered speech, who at 14 still clutched dolls meant for toddlers, who laughed with joy at falling snow but had to be watched constantly, lest she wander barefoot into the frozen gardens. These glimpses suggest a hidden princess whose mind remained childlike, whose life unfolded in a corner of the palace unseen by the public eye. And then came 1917, the revolution. The Romanovs fell, their palaces overrun, their secrets scattered. In the chaos, the child disappears from history. Did soldiers find her in the East Wing nursery? Bewildered by shouts and gunfire she could not understand. Did loyal servants spirit her away into the countryside, where she might live anonymously in some village, a woman who played with dolls and laughed at snowflakes? Or was she, like so many others of her family, lost in the firestorm of civil war? We cannot know. What is certain is this: she vanished, not just from history books, but from memory itself. The new Soviet order had no use for royal ghosts, and the old regime had already buried her existence in silence. Her fate, like that of the French infant 2 centuries earlier, became another absence, a life marked only by the shadows it left behind. These two stories, separated by time and geography, reveal the same pattern. Whether in the Catholic grandeur of Bourbon France or the Orthodox majesty of Romanov Russia, difference was treated as shame. The same whispered prayers, the same hushed erasures, the same refusal to name what was too uncomfortable to accept. In the end, what lingers is not the details of their conditions but the human ache that surrounds them. A queen kneeling at an altar for a child she could not save, servants drawing curtains over a room where a girl played forever with dolls, both lives carried away by silence. These children remind us that beneath crowns and thrones, humanity is fragile, and that fragility has long been the thing monarchies feared most. Spain in the 17th century was a kingdom haunted by its own bloodline. The Habsburgs, already infamous for generations of inbreeding, prided themselves on a supposed purity that was meant to guarantee strength, yet the truth whispered in the halls of Madrid was far darker. Each marriage between cousins or uncles and nieces narrowed the gene pool further, and with it came frailty, deformity, and minds that never matured. The most famous example was Charles II, remembered as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. His jaw jutted so severely he could barely chew, and he struggled to speak clearly, not uttering words until the age of 4. But Charles, who would eventually sit upon the throne, was merely the visible face of a dynasty filled with hidden children. In private records kept by court physicians, Notes disguised in Latin and tucked away in medical texts appear chilling references to unnamed infants born with Mongol features, the archaic term physicians used long before science gave a more accurate description. These children were not painted into royal portraits, not baptized before glittering altars, not spoken of in succession documents. They were ghosts from the moment they drew breath. One physician, Diego Mateo Zapata, dared to suggest a radical thought, that these children were not curses, but simply variations of God's creation. He described a princess with a small stature and great difficulty in swallowing, yet also a boundless affection. She embraced every servant she met and swayed with delight to music, even when her clapping fell out of rhythm. Zapata wrote that perhaps such children revealed the mysterious beauty of God's variety. For this heresy, the Inquisition turned against him. His notes were hidden in the false bottom of a book, discovered only centuries later. His compassion was smothered, as were the children whose lives he documented. While Spain concealed its imperfect heirs through silence, the Ottoman Empire handled its secrets in a different but equally cruel manner. Sultan Mehmed III, who ruled at the turn of the 17th century, reportedly fathered a son born with distinctive features and developmental delays. In the brutal logic of Ottoman succession, only the strongest and most cunning princes survived. Any sign of weakness was an invitation to elimination. Yet this boy was not killed outright. Instead, he was consigned to the cafes, the cage. The cafes was a gilded prison within Topkapi Palace, where potential heirs were locked away to prevent intrigue. For most princes, it was a place of anxious waiting, filled with plotting and despair. But for this forgotten son, it became something stranger. Records of palace eunuchs note provisions, food, clothes, candles delivered to a particular chamber for 23 years after the child's supposed death. A guard's memoir, written decades later, adds a haunting detail. When Sultan Ahmed I died in 1617 and the cafes was opened to determine who would ascend, one room was found unlike any other. Inside lived a man with the body of an adult, but the mind of a child. He had filled the floor with thousands of shards of colored glass, meticulously arranged into intricate patterns that no one else could decipher. He sang the same songs over and over, laughed at shadows, and greeted his astonished captors as if they were playmates. What became of him after that discovery, no one knows. The records fall silent. Perhaps he was eliminated quietly, another threat to dynastic order. Perhaps he was left to fade away in yet another hidden corner. What endures is the image of a life spent in seclusion, creating beauty that no one else would ever see, humming melodies no one else would ever hear. Spain and the Ottoman world, two empires separated by faith, culture, and geography, reacted in almost identical ways when faced with children who defied the royal ideal. They hid them. They excised their names from history, burned their portraits, confined them to cages of silence. What unites these stories is not the particular throne but the terror of imperfection. And yet, between the cracks, we glimpse humanity. Zapata, risking the wrath of the Inquisition, wrote with tenderness about a child's affection. An anonymous guard, decades later, could not help but remember the strange man in the cage who smiled at broken glass as if it were jewels. Even in systems designed to erase, the humanity of these children seeped through. But for the families who ruled, humanity was never enough. The dynasty demanded symbols of strength, heirs who could ride, command, and marry. And so, while Europe and the Near East celebrated their crowns in gold and ceremony, behind the walls of their palaces lived children who would never be crowned, who would never be named, who would never be remembered except in whispers. Not all royal families buried their hidden children in the same kind of silence. Some, while still concealing them from the public eye, left behind faint traces of tenderness, as though compassion and secrecy lived side by side in uneasy alliance. In Bavaria, the Wittelsbach dynasty produced many eccentric figures, none more famous than Ludwig II, the mad king who built castles like dreamscapes. Yet even before Ludwig, whispers of hidden heirs circulated. In 1826, Princess Alexandra was born. Official biographies claim she died at the age of 3. The records are neat, tidy, convenient, but the palace servants knew otherwise. In hushed tones they spoke of the quiet wing of Nymphenburg Palace, where Alexandra lived out her days away from the eyes of courtiers and visiting dignitaries. A governess's diary, long forgotten and later donated to the Bavarian State Library, tells her true story. Alexandra grew to adulthood, reaching 25 before her death in 1851. The governess described painstaking lessons: how to dress herself, how to hold a spoon, how to recognize letters she would never learn to form into words. And yet, within this limited world, there was joy. Alexandra adored her pet canaries, listening for hours to their song. She clapped her hands in delight at their trills, perfectly content in the music of creatures who asked nothing of her. For once, a hidden royal life was marked not only by shame, but by some measure of affection. Yet even here, conditions applied. Alexandra could live, but only unseen. She could laugh, but never in public. When she died, her body was interred quietly in an unmarked section of the royal crypt, her life erased with the same efficiency as any court decree. A century earlier, in Portugal, the House of Braganza faced a similar dilemma. In 1734, Infanta Maria Francisca was born to King John V. By tradition, painters were immediately commissioned to capture a royal infant's likeness, immortalizing their entry into dynastic history. But when the artist Jean Rank attempted Maria's portrait, he faltered. Later, on his deathbed, he confessed to a priest that he had been unable to satisfy the king. "How do you paint innocence itself?" he asked, "when innocence is not what power demands?" The sketches were destroyed, the commission abandoned. Maria Francisca was sent to the convent of Santos o Novo in Lisbon, raised by nuns who left gentle records of a child who loved folding altar cloths, feeding animals, and humming along to hymns, though she never remembered the words. She died at age 11 of a fever. The nuns buried her in their cemetery, her grave marker inscribed only with the words, "God's child." No name, no dates, no royal connection. For a brief span, Maria belonged more to the convent than to the crown, remembered as a little girl who smiled at prayers, not as a princess erased from a dynasty. Denmark, in the early 19th century, employed subtler methods of concealment. In 1803, Prince Gustav, son of Frederick VI, was born. Unlike Alexandra or Maria, Gustav's existence was not officially denied. Instead, an elaborate fiction was spun. Gustav suffered from a delicate, nervous condition that required him to travel constantly for his health. The public believed him to be a fragile child wandering across Europe's spas and sanatoriums. In reality, he was shifted between remote royal properties every few months, far from curious eyes. His tutors, more guardians than educators, were instructed to file glowing reports of progress in studies. But the private letters they left behind, preserved in the Danish royal archives, reveal something very different. Gustav struggled with reading and writing, yet he possessed astonishing abilities of his own. One tutor marveled at his perfect memory. He could recall every servant he had ever met, their names and faces. Another noted his uncanny skill at predicting weather changes days in advance, as though he sensed subtle cues no one else noticed. He even seemed able to detect lies, growing agitated when someone spoke falsely. One tutor, Hans Eriksson, dared to question the narrow definition of intelligence itself. "Perhaps," he wrote, "we measure intelligence too narrowly. The prince understands things I do not, sees patterns I cannot perceive. Who truly has the deficit, him, or those of us who cannot enter his world?" It was a radical thought, far ahead of his time. Yet the court dismissed such notions. Gustav's gifts, however extraordinary, did not translate into diplomacy, treaties, or heirs. And so he remained hidden, shuffled endlessly from one estate to another, his truth covered by the fiction of perpetual travel. When Gustav died at 31, likely from a heart condition common among those with Down syndrome, his death was announced as occurring abroad while seeking treatment. At night, his body was returned quietly to Denmark, buried before dawn. His entire existence compressed into a single line in the royal genealogy. Prince Gustav, dead abroad. A life rich with peculiar gifts, erased by a sentence meant to preserve appearances. Bavaria, Portugal, Denmark, 3 monarchies, 3 strategies, a secret wing, a convent, a fiction of endless travel. Each devised its own method of erasure, and yet in each, flickers of humanity survive. The canaries that Alexandra adored, the prayers Maria Francisca hummed, the uncanny insights Gustav displayed. These moments remind us that no matter how thick the walls of concealment, the human spirit found ways to reveal itself. Even when power tried to erase them, these children left behind whispers fragile but indelible. The northern kingdoms of Europe, often seen as bastions of modernity and order, were no less haunted by their hidden heirs. Their castles and palaces, wrapped in winter fog and Lutheran austerity, concealed children whose names rarely appeared in official genealogies, whose lives survived only as whispers in memoirs and fragments of correspondence. In Sweden, the Bernadotte dynasty carried its own silence. In 1852, a child named Prince Carlos was born. The records claim he died after only 3 months, a brief entry in the court almanacs. But unofficial evidence tells another story. Servants' testimonies, physician bills, and requisitions for food and toys suggest the child lived much longer, perhaps until the age of 9, sequestered at Tullgarn Palace, 30 miles from Stockholm. One memoir, written decades later by the son of a palace groundskeeper, recalls a strange boy he played with in the gardens. The boy could not speak but laughed constantly, as if every discovery delighted him. He was fearless, wandering among ant colonies, or staring for hours at the movement of clouds. And then, without warning, the boy would vanish days before the royal family returned from their travels. Only years later did the groundskeeper's son realize who the mysterious playmate had been. He was like a ghost, he wrote, but the happiest ghost imaginable. Austria-Hungary, bound by centuries of Habsburg blood, held secrets even more carefully guarded. In 1868, Archduke Karl Ludwig, brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, welcomed a son. Officially, the child was declared stillborn. Yet the diary of a midwife discovered during World War II, tucked among family papers, tells a different truth. The infant lived but displayed features that made the emperor recoil. Within hours, the baby was taken from his mother, who was told he had died. Years later, the same midwife was summoned to a monastery outside Vienna. There, among the monks, she encountered a boy she recognized instantly, the child she had delivered years earlier. The monks had been paid to raise him as an orphan, never told of his true lineage. They called him Felix, the happy one, because despite his limitations, he radiated joy. He helped with simple tasks, carrying wood, sweeping, tending the gardens, and the brothers cherished him as one of their own. When scarlet fever took his life in 1880, the monastery mourned deeply. In their records, the abbot wrote, "Our Felix has returned to God, who surely loves him better than the world ever could." To them, he was no ghost, but a child who had brought holiness into their midst. Prussia's story is darker still. In 1889, Prince Waldemar was born to the sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Like so many before him, he was hidden from public life, erased from succession documents. But his nurse, Emma Müller, could not accept the silence. Each year, on his birthday, she secretly commissioned a local artist to paint his portrait. 17 portraits in all, each one showing the boy as he grew, his features tenderly rendered, his eyes bright with life. After Waldemar's death in 1906, Emma carried these portraits to his mother, hoping they might preserve his memory. Instead, they were burned before her eyes, the final trace of his existence reduced to ash. For the rest of her life, Emma wrote letters to newspapers, pleading for his story to be told. None were ever published. Her letters, found only after her death, describe a boy who loved trains, who could identify every bird by its song, who memorized entire orchestral pieces after hearing them once. He was not less than, Emma wrote again and again. He was different, and different in God's eyes is not wrong. These northern ghosts, Carlos the laughing boy of Sweden, Felix the happy orphan of Austria, Waldemar the lost prince of Prussia, remind us that history is as much about what is erased as what is recorded. Their families, obsessed with bloodlines and appearances, consigned them to silence, but servants, monks, and nurses preserved their humanity in secret acts of remembrance. It is often said that history is written by the victors, but sometimes the truest history is written by those who had no power at all: the caretaker who saves a drawing, the monk who writes a line in a ledger, the nurse who hides portraits in her attic. Through these fragments, the hidden children of Europe whisper across the centuries, refusing to be forgotten. By the late 19th century, Europe was changing. Science was advancing, railways and telegraphs were shrinking distances, and monarchies were under growing pressure to modernize. Yet behind palace doors, the treatment of royal children born different remained much the same: silence, concealment, erasure. In Italy, the House of Savoy attempted something unusual, a middle ground between denial and acknowledgement. Princess Giovanna, born in 1879, was not completely hidden. Instead, she was presented carefully at certain public events, always at a distance, always briefly, her presence tightly managed. The public was told she was delicate, unable to endure long ceremonies. Behind closed doors, Giovanna lived with a small household who treated her with kindness. Tutors encouraged her memory for music, her ability to learn through repetition, her gift for understanding animals. For once, a hidden royal was allowed moments of dignity. When she died at 33, her funeral was private but not shameful. King Alberto I, her uncle, reportedly said, "She lived as God made her, and that was enough." It was not revolution, but it was compassion, something rare among dynasties. Belgium offered no such mercy. King Leopold II, infamous for his brutal exploitation of the Congo, showed equal ruthlessness in his own palace. In 1864, a daughter was born, who never appeared in official records. Princess Stephanie, Leopold's other daughter, would later write in her memoirs of a sister, not spoken of, a girl whose room was eventually sealed behind a wall. Servants later recalled hearing a child's voice from within singing nonsense songs, calling for a mother who never came. One maid, Marie Delacroix, risked her position to slip food and toys through a crack. The child pushed back drawings, crude images of smiling figures, suns with faces, and one sheet covered in berry-stained handprints surrounded by hearts. When Marie later showed this drawing to historians, it stood as one of the few tangible traces of a royal child deliberately erased from history. Romania, whose monarchy was still young, confronted its own hidden sorrow in 1893. Crown Prince Carol's son was declared dead within hours of birth, yet Queen Elizabeth, known as Carmen Silva in her poetry, left behind coded journal entries about her angel child. She described him as too pure for earth, recalled to heaven, but her words hint at something more. Records from a monastery during that time list a mysterious benefactor donating funds for the care of a special child of God, with instructions that he be given music, art supplies, and spoken to with kindness. For 7 years, the donations continued. Then they ceased. The monastery's chronicle notes the child died of fever that same year. Perhaps Elizabeth could not save her son in public, but in secret, she ensured his brief life was filled with gentleness. Even in the 20th century, concealment continued. In Greece, during the 1920 seconds, a physician treating the exiled royals encountered a teenage princess whose existence was never acknowledged. She had Down syndrome, hidden from birth, raised by a loyal servant. When she fell ill with pneumonia, the doctor treated her and succeeded in saving her life. But when he informed the family, their reaction was chilling. They offered him money to solve the problem permanently. Horrified, he fled the country, never learning what became of the girl who had called him nice man, over and over, the only words she knew. In the Netherlands, whispers persisted of Queen Wilhelmina's lost child. Officially, she had only one daughter, Juliana, yet staff spoke of a second pregnancy, a birth with no announcement, and a child who vanished from the palace soon after. In Friesland, a farmer's family later told stories of a foster daughter, left with them by mysterious benefactors who paid generously for her care. The girl lived until 1934, bearing an uncanny resemblance to the royal family. No one dared to say it aloud, but the resemblance was enough to fuel whispers that never died. Norway, newly independent in 1905, faced its own test. In 1912, Princess Ragnhild was born to the future King Olaf V. Officially, she lived 3 days. Unofficially, she lived for 8 years in a Swiss medical facility, visited monthly by a veiled noblewoman from Norway. Nazi forces later seized the clinic's records during World War II, and among them was the file of a child described with mongoloid features, who loved affection and simple pleasures. She died in 1920, her cause of death attributed to influenza, though it was almost certainly heart complications linked to her condition. From Italy's cautious half-acknowledgement to Belgium's cruelty, from Romania's hidden kindness to Greece's chilling callousness, these stories reveal a Europe struggling with the same pattern. Difference was not to be seen. Each dynasty crafted its own method of concealment, some gentle, some ruthless, but all were united by fear of what a single child's existence might mean for power, image, and legitimacy. And yet, through cracks in the silence, humanity always leaked out. A drawing pushed through a wall, a secret donation to a monastery, a doctor clutching the hand of a girl who trusted him. These fragments, fragile and fleeting, are all that remain of lives otherwise erased. The 20th century promised progress. Science was advancing at a breathtaking pace, Wars were reshaping nations, and monarchies, those ancient institutions of blood and ritual, were being forced to adapt. Yet for children born with Down syndrome within royal families, the story was far from over. Concealment did not vanish with the dawn of modernity. In some cases, it deepened. In 1915, Princess Alexandrine of Prussia was born to Crown Prince Wilhelm. Unlike earlier generations, her family did not announce her death or erase her existence entirely. Instead, they placed her in a specialized institution where she received some education, learning to write her name, to read simple texts, even to play piano, awkwardly, but with enthusiasm. But then came the rise of the Nazis, whose ideology of racial purity demanded the elimination of those deemed unfit. Their euthanasia program targeted thousands of disabled children and adults, including those with Down syndrome. For the Hohenzollerns, this presented an impossible choice. Records suggest Alexandrine was quietly moved to Switzerland, given a false name, and allowed to live out her days in secrecy. She survived the war, dying in 1980, outliving the very empire into which she had been born. Her story is both tragic and remarkable. Tragic for the erasure, remarkable for the survival. Other royal families, witnessing the Nazi atrocities, began to reckon with their own centuries of silence. Luxembourg broke precedent in 1957, when Prince John was born with Down syndrome. His family did not celebrate his birth publicly, but neither did they erase him. For the first time in European royal history, a child with Down syndrome was admitted to exist. He lived in a care facility, his life acknowledged in a quiet but revolutionary way. By the 1972, the Spanish monarchy went further. When King Juan Carlos's nephew was born with Down syndrome, the family did not hide him away. He appeared in photographs, attended some family events, and was spoken of openly as part of the royal household. The sight of a royal child with Down syndrome acknowledged, not erased, was something Europe had never seen before. It was a small revolution, but a profound one. And yet, even in modern times, secrecy lingers. Prenatal testing, now able to detect Down syndrome before birth, presents families royal and common alike, with choices no less fraught than those of the past. Some pregnancies are quietly ended, continuing the centuries-old tradition of erasing difference before it even begins. Others are embraced, with families committing to raising children who, though limited in some ways, are capable of extraordinary joy. The last confirmed case of a royal child hidden completely from public knowledge occurred in the 1960s. Since then, privacy laws and changing social attitudes have blurred the line between concealment and protection. Today, when rumors arise of royal children with disabilities, palaces release careful statements about privacy, about respect for family matters. The secrecy remains, but cloaked now in the language of compassion rather than shame. Looking back, the pattern is painfully clear. For centuries, royal children born with Down syndrome were hidden, denied, erased. Their families, who claimed divine appointment, who ruled nations, who demanded loyalty, proved incapable of granting the most basic recognition to their most vulnerable children. What does this say about power? About fear? About humanity? It tells us that for all the grandeur of thrones and crowns, these families were bound by the same weaknesses as any others: shame, pride, the terror of imperfection. But because their legitimacy rested on the myth of superiority, they could never admit what nature had made plain. That variation is the rule, not the exception. That perfection is an illusion, and humanity is always mixed with fragility. And yet, the hidden children themselves, those who laughed at snowflakes, who sang nonsense songs, who memorized bird calls, who played with shards of glass as though they were jewels, reveal something that their families could not see. They remind us that joy does not depend on perfection, that worth is not measured by treaties or thrones. They remind us that humanity is found most purely not in power, but in vulnerability. Picture again that child in the Habsburg Tower, watching dust motes in a shaft of light. He is not alone. Across centuries, across palaces and convents, across dynasties and empires, countless others shared his fate. Their names scratched from records, their portraits burned, their graves unmarked. Yet they lived, they laughed, they mattered. In the silence of their erasure, they speak still, reminding us that the true deficit was never theirs, but their families'. A deficit not of chromosomes, but of compassion.